the city in the Delta that Egypt had to take back. In 1650 BC, Egypt lost the north without one clean invasion story or one decisive border battle. No foreign army simply crossed the frontier, broke every gate, and marched south in a single season. The loss came slower through traders, craftsmen, sailors, herdsmen, and families already inside Egypt. For nearly 2 centuries, people from Western Asia lived, worked, traded, and buried their dead in the Delta. Then, the northern half of the Nile Valley answered to a city Egyptian memory could never forgive. Not Thebes, not Memphis, not Giza, Avaris. This was a city of mud brick, canals, horses, ships, foreign palaces, and crowded harbor streets. At its height, Avaris may have held 30,000 people inside its walls and busy harbor districts. Its docks reached Crete, Cyprus, Lebanon, and the sea routes Theban Egypt could not truly control. It had horse paddocks, chariot crews, bow workshops, bronze weapons, and foreign administrative power. For more than a century, the Hyksos ruled Egypt's north from that wet city in the Delta. The city was low, muddy, and practical, yet it carried a power the old southern temples felt every day. When Egypt finally retook Avaris around 1550 BC, it did not simply burn the city away. It kept the docks, the records, the bow workshops, the horse paddocks, and the useful waterways. The weapons that kept Avaris beyond reach became the weapons Egypt used to build its empire. Egypt did not destroy Avaris. Egypt became Avaris. That reversal is the hidden engine of this story, and it begins beneath the Delta mud. Under el-Daba, the buried city still asks the question Egypt tried to leave underground. What happens when a civilization leaves its front door open until someone builds a throne inside? El-Daba sat at one of the most strategic positions in the eastern Nile Delta's wet frontier. It stood near the Pelusiac branch and the channels feeding Egypt toward the Mediterranean coast. Egyptian administrators noticed the value before Hyksos rule made the place impossible to ignore. A garrison once made sense there because the geography was too useful to leave unmanaged. Into that framework came traders, craftsmen, metalworkers, sailors, families, and foreign specialists. They brought Canaanite material culture, Syrian bronze traditions, and links across the Eastern Sea. By 1650 BC, the settlement had become a city of weight, wealth, and political consequence. It was no longer just a useful border town. It had become a place that could command the north. Minoan ships from Crete could unload near its docks, while Cypriot copper entered its warehouses. Lebanese cedar, imported pottery, animals, tools, and ceilings passed through its administrative hands. Its horse paddocks supported a military system older Egyptian armies were not built to answer. A chariot archer could move faster than infantry and strike farther than a simple bowman. That changed distance, and it changed fear in ways older commanders could not ignore for long. A city with horses did not merely hold territory. It changed the speed at which danger arrived. Then, excavations recovered painted plaster fragments from the palace complex during the 20th century. The walls carried Minoan-style frescoes in a tradition familiar from the palaces of the Aegean. Bull-leaping scenes like those at Knossos appeared in the palace of rulers controlling northern Egypt. The official memory called the Hyksos period chaos, foreign disorder, and a wound in Ma'at. The ground at Tel el-Daba called it something more complicated and much harder to erase. The name Hyksos was not what these rulers called themselves in Avaris' streets and palaces. It came from the Egyptian phrase Heka Kasut, a label meaning rulers of foreign lands. That label gave scribes a way to name a dynasty that did not fit Egypt's sacred order. Egyptian theology placed Pharaoh at the center of Ma'at, the balance sustaining earth and heaven. A foreign ruler in the north was not just a rival or a passing military inconvenience. It was a rupture in the structure Egyptian institutions claimed to protect each morning and night. The wound was material as well as sacred, because resources now flowed through Avaris first. Grain moved north, papyrus marshes sat under Hyksos rule, and cedar roots crossed their territory. Thebes could still perform rituals, count offerings, and speak the old language of sacred unity. But every formula about the two lands now carried a silence inside it. Priests could speak of unity, but the river itself carried tribute toward another center of power. North and south were no longer held by one unquestioned hand. The old crown still had two halves, but the land beneath it no longer obeyed one rhythm. Avaris had the gate. It had the roads, the horses, the bows, the harbor, the scribes, and the foreign networks. Every resource needed for statecraft could be touched by a city answering to another throne. For a while, the arrangement could be explained as survivable, practical, or politically necessary. But a wound left open too long either becomes normal or becomes impossible to endure. Around 1560 BC, the South began choosing the second option, and the old silence started breaking. One early physical witness to the struggle is not a triumphal wall, royal hymn, or victory stele. It is a skull. Mummy CG 6151, the remains of Seqenenre Daosun, preserves 5 weapon wounds to the head. A CT analysis in 2021 studied those wounds with unusual forensic detail and precision. The marks suggest several weapons, several angles, and a violent end near the moment of death. A narrow-bladed axe struck one side of the skull, while other blows landed from other positions. A spear point and blunt impacts added to a pattern difficult to explain as single combat. The analysis points toward a ruler surrounded, with no protective formation closing the gap in time. He died with no one between him and the weapons. That is why the skull matters. It shows that the first answer to Avaris was courage without the full tools the new war required. It is not here to make one king the main character of the story. It is an object, a witness, and the shape of a failed first answer. The skull says old Egypt went north before it fully understood the war Avaris had made possible. It says, inherited weapons were no longer enough against chariots, composite bows, and faster movement. It says the Delta had changed faster than the South was prepared to accept. Avaris could not be taken by pride, memory, or sacred language alone. A city that had learned horses, bows, roads, canals, and foreign networks demanded a different Egypt. The skull therefore becomes more than evidence of death. It becomes evidence of adaptation delayed. After that first terrible pressure, the war moved north again and carved itself into stone. The Kamose stelae preserve one of the most urgent military voices from ancient Egypt. But the center of this scene is not the man, it is the stone. The stone remembers the moment Thebes stopped calling the wound sustainable. On those stelae, the South calculates what it has lost to powers on both sides. The Hyksos hold the north, while Kush in Nubia presses from the southern direction. Thebes stands between them, narrowed into a corridor barely large enough to call a kingdom. That image gives the text its force. Thebes was not merely offended by Avaris. It was trapped between powers that could crush it together. Egypt was not merely divided, it was bracketed. Then a diplomatic letter changed the meaning of the conflict even further. Egyptian forces intercepted a message from Avaris to Kerma, asking pressure from both directions. A letter became a trophy, and a threat became a line carved for later eyes. It proved the occupation was not stable equilibrium, but an active strategic danger. The campaign pushed far enough north to reach the outer estate lands of Avaris itself. Standing grain was cut, supply boats were loaded, and forward units could see the city. They could see it. But seeing Avaris was not the same as taking Avaris. The gates still held, and the wound remained open for another generation. Avaris was close enough to see, but still too strong to enter without a deeper transformation. The final campaign began in a silence, preserved only by scattered objects and later inscriptions. There was no single heroic moment at first, only preparation stretched across anxious years. A child came to the throne while the war had already consumed his father and brother. What survives from those preparation years is not a detailed royal diary of planning. Instead, Queen Ahotep's burial equipment preserves 3 golden military flies for field service. Those flies are small, but they carry the weight of a decade no monument explains. They suggest supply chains, regency, administration, loyalty, and war kept alive while a king grew. The last campaign needed more than courage, because courage had already failed near the Delta. It needed time to build Egyptian composite bows using the technology Avaris had brought north. It needed time to train chariot crews in a battlefield logic Egypt had learned painfully. It needed boats, canals, rations, bowstrings, wheels, horse care, and scribes counting everything. The fullest campaign memory comes from the tomb of Ahmose, son of Ibana, at El-Kab. His inscription describes repeated fighting in the approaches, across channels and agricultural zones. The taking of Avaris was not one dramatic assault beneath a perfect sunrise. It was a grinding, multi-season siege that tightened the perimeter around the city. Egyptian forces returned again and again, cutting routes and controlling channels until the position weakened. Around 1550 BC, Avaris fell. But Tel el-Daba shows no grand fire layer, no simple collapse, and no total destruction. The palace continued as a palace. The workshops continued. The flag changed. The city did not. Avaris had changed hands, but the geography, workshops, docks, and military knowledge remained. For more than 50 years, Tel el-Daba has made the official memory harder to keep. The ground returned horse burials beneath the floors of Hyksos period buildings in the Delta. That detail matters because it places the horse inside daily life before later royal art celebrated it. These were not horses shown in later royal art, but real animals placed under real rooms. They are among the earliest horse remains found in Egypt and belong to settlers already there. They arrived not only as gifts or trophies, but as working animals in a foreign-shaped city. In the same world, excavators found traces linked to composite bow production. Trimmed horn, sinew preparation, and shaped wood point toward bow-making traditions from the Levant. The materials mattered because this was not ordinary Egyptian archery with a familiar, simple bow. It was part of a military package Egypt later absorbed and used for imperial campaigns. Then there were the frescoes. Minoan-style painted panels appeared in the palace complex at the administrative heart of Avaris. Their technique, pigments, subjects, and bull-leaping scenes pointed toward craftsmen from the Aegean. A Delta palace held images that belonged visually to the same world as Knossos. None of this appears clearly in official Egyptian accounts of the Hyksos period. The monuments said chaos, the ground said connection. Horse bones, bow debris, chariot fittings, imported objects, and painted walls formed a different archive. They described an international Bronze Age hub that also ruled northern Egypt for a century. Avaris was not only a wound, it was a machine. It converted contact into power, and later it converted defeat into knowledge for the state that retook it. 3 centuries after Egypt absorbed Avaris, the same region returned to the center of power. The old doorway had not lost its importance, simply because a new dynasty controlled it. Ramesses II built Pi-Ramesses in the Delta, using a landscape whose value was already proven. The old Hyksos city had stood where canals, routes, harbors, and military movement converged. That geography did not stop mattering because the rulers changed. The wound became infrastructure. Pi-Ramesses rose as a royal and military capital for campaigns toward the Levant. Administrative texts describe its harbors, military installations, temple districts, and immense urban activity. The exact relationship between el-Daba and later traditions remains debated in several fields, but the archaeological point is strong enough for the story we are following. The place Egypt needed to reclaim became the place Egypt kept returning to build on. That is the irony Avaris left under the Delta. The city official memory tried hardest to simplify became part of Egypt's imperial geography. Egypt could celebrate victory and still keep the enemy's doorway. It could condemn the Hyksos and still use the roads, canals, and military logic they exposed. Avaris had been dangerous because it stood in exactly the right place. After liberation, that did not become less true. The thing Egypt wanted to forget was the thing Egypt kept rebuilding upon. The Delta remembered usefulness better than royal memory remembered shame. The official Egyptian account of the Hyksos age preferred a clean and satisfying narrative. Foreign disorder entered, Mot was violated, heroic Theban kings restored balance, and Egypt was whole. That version worked beautifully on stone, but it could not hold everything the ground preserved. It did not describe the bow workshops Avaris left for the 18th dynasty to use. It did not admit the chariot, compound bow, and new doctrine came through humiliation. It did not easily say that occupation had also been a century of forced education. The wound was described as suffering. The healing was described as restoration. But el-Daba preserves the more complicated truth. A foreign city damaged Egypt, then changed the tools Egypt used to become an empire. The new kingdom projected power farther than earlier Egypt had ever managed. Its armies moved into the Levant, its kings carved victories, and its chariots became royal icons. Behind those images stands the city the official story did not want to thank. The chariot scenes of empire carry a memory of the foreign city that made chariots necessary. Avaris. The question is not whether Egypt owed gratitude to the source of its deepest humiliation. The question is whether any civilization can admit what it learned from the thing that wounded it. The skull, the stelae, the horse bones, and the frescoes all ask that question together. They ask it in the language of objects because objects outlast the institutions that feared them. Stone can flatter a king, but a broken workshop floor can preserve the part no king wanted carved. The city Egypt had to take back is 35 centuries underground in the modern Eastern Delta. It is not a monument that towers above tourists, but a buried argument under fields and canals. Its mud brick walls are compressed into gray-brown soil under fields, canals, and later settlements. The Minoan frescoes survive in fragments, catalogued and reassembled from pieces smaller than a hand. The horse bones rest in archives, and the bow production debris remains in technical reports. The skull of Seqenenre Tau II is in the Cairo Museum. The golden flies of Ahotep are there too, silent evidence of the decade that held the war. None of these objects are displayed as one complete story in one room. But they are the same story. The skull says the first answer failed. The stelae say Thebes could still see the city. The flies say the war survived through administration, supply, and a mother holding power for a child. The horse bones say the military world changed before Egypt was ready for it. The frescoes say Avaris belonged to a Mediterranean world larger than Egyptian memory wanted. The bow debris says the lesson became practical. And the later Delta capital says the wound became useful. Avaris left no monument to itself, and no victory stele admits it taught Egypt to fight. It exists in the ground, where objects keep records after political memory runs out of stone. The city is underground. The question is not, what gate are you ignoring? Because it does not look dangerous yet. Because Avaris did not begin as a disaster. It began as a useful opening no one feared enough.